Good afternoon, Wim, and welcome to this, the MasterCard Life Through a Different Lens conversation series, coming live from my side from the 77th La Biennale here in Venice, and from your side live in Berlin. I'm sorry that we can't be together in person on this occasion, but we have an audience watching us live on priceless.com and labiennale.org who are going to be desperate to hear your every word for the next 40 minutes.
If I say something.
I'm really hoping you do.
And I greet all of them listening or watching. Hello there. I wish I could be with you in Venice, not just virtually.
But we are delighted that you're with us virtually. And to kick off our conversation, the reason that we are so delighted that you're with us virtually is you are a true maestro, sir. You are seen already in your career as one of the greats of cinema, having created such legendary pieces that have changed the way people look and see things. So if we may, I'd like to start at the beginning of your career and ask you what inspired you to become a filmmaker.
I had no intention to become a filmmaker. It never crossed my mind. I really want to be a painter. And that was my biggest desire through my entire childhood. I want to be all sorts of things, from priest to architect to God knows what, but then I really want to be a painter. And trying to become a painter, I ended up in Paris, like where else? And in Paris, I discovered the Cinematheque because as a painting student, I lived in a tiny little room that was unheated and lonely. And the Cinematheque was warm and films were cheap, just 25 cents a film. And you could see 4 or 5 a day and be in the warmth and surrounded by other people. And in the beginning, I just went there for that. And then I started to like what I saw more and more. And then I bought books on the history of cinema. And in the end, I saw more than 1,000 films, a crash course in the history of cinema. And I realized that was it. That was even better than painting because it included painting, but it was also literature and music and theater and philosophy and religion. It was everything I liked just in one bundle. It was called cinema.
And as you were doing that incredibly intensive research of your 1,000 films to inspire you, was there a standout film or a standout director who really just propelled you to see things differently?
Yes, there was, because, first I just saw everything that was playing, and the Cinematheque played Chinese movies and movies from Africa and old German masters and European cinema, history of cinema, and all sorts of things. And then the first retrospective that I was able to follow in its entirety was dedicated to an American filmmaker, Anthony Mann. So that was the first director I got to know really through his entire work, and I followed all these movies, and finally I started to understand what that is, a director, because I realized what these films had in common and that they had a language and a style. So he might not be recognized as one of the greatest masters of cinema, but he, for me, was the first one where it clicked and I realized that's what it is. It's a handwriting. It's something that somebody does differently from others. And I bought a book on him and I studied his films, and I learned so much from this man, Anthony Mann, just because he happened to be the first one to teach me about cinema and about editing and about framing and storytelling.
And it's wonderful that you bring us with that point to the storytelling, because obviously they're creating a film, creating a piece of artwork that can be enjoyed by millions around the world, does all come down to being hinged on a great story. Talk to me a little bit in terms of your process when it comes to identifying the story and then thinking about how you visually bring that to life.
I've always had my share of problems with stories because there's so many of them. Actually, there's way too many. And the thing is, I always thought stories were a little bit of an artificial entity. In my life, I never lived a story. Never a story happened to me with beginning, middle, and end. Stories were books and stories were artificial. So I struggled with stories because there were too many of them. And so, how do you choose? And finally, in the beginning, without knowing, and then more and more consciously, I realized that there was something else that was helping me to find a story that was right for me and that I could handle and that I could believe in. And that, believe it or not, for me was places. If I liked a place, whether it was a city or a landscape or a desert or whatever, if I liked a place and figured I had a connection to it and I would love to, wanted to do something there, like a painter maybe who would like to paint it, then I started to think what sort of a story could happen here. And when it clicked between this immense wealth of stories that everybody has in their minds, and I'm collecting stories, of course, by the hundreds, and every day there's more stories, but I was always afraid that it was random. But if there was a place that I liked a lot, I could try to figure out what story belonged to this place. And what was a story that could only be told here or that should be told here and nowhere else. And if I found that story, sort of the crossroads between a story and the place where it belonged, then I was happy. And then I started to believe in the story and in the characters because otherwise they overwhelmed me. And I had my share of doubts in stories. Were they really true? How could a story be told so that it was true or that it became true? And how can you believe it in a story where you know the ending already? And I always figured that was the most difficult thing in filmmaking. Once you had a beginning, and it's easy to have a beginning. I mean, I can think of 100 beginnings of movies right now to start with that or that or that. But then you get into the storytelling, and then the big question comes, where does it lead to? How does it end? And that is the most difficult thing, I feel, for me. If I know the beginning and the ending already because it's a complete story, then I start having my doubts. How can a story be true if when I started, I know already its ending? So I solved this for myself by discovering the genre of road movies, because you start somewhere, which is easy, somewhere the road starts, and then you follow the road. And the road, by definition, is a chronological thing. The road, you go there, and then you sleep, and then you go somewhere else, and then you sleep again. So an itinerary is always something chronological. And I realized that for me, storytelling was so much better, and I believed so much more in it if I could do it in the order of me and my team and my actors living it. While in most of cinema, storytelling is zigzag. Sometimes on a shoot, they tell you, the producers or the production managers tell you to shoot the end on the first week and the beginning maybe only at the end. And that completely loses me. I get completely discombobulated and I don't know where I am anymore. So I love to live the story. So I discovered road movies as a way to live your story. And that helped me a lot, especially in the beginning. The first films of mine were almost all road movies because I didn't know any other way to be allowed to shoot them in chronological order.
You spoke a little bit there on something that I'd like to explore a little further with you, which is how do you know that a story is true? And just to understand what that means to you as the storyteller, as the creator of the journey that you're taking your audience on, how important is that fundamental truth to the story that you're telling?
That's a big question. First of all, I'd like to say that if I go to the movies and the film starts and it says, after a true story. I always laugh. I cannot help but laugh because it seems like a contradiction in terms. A true story. A story is invented to begin with. So, what is a true story? And most of all, mostly people mean this is a story that actually happened. See, a story that actually happened. Yes, you can say that as a true story if it did actually happen like this, but most of the time it says after a true story, and that's when it gets tricky. So, well, what is the difference between the story that happened and the one that they tell in the movie? So, a story has a truth, but it's not something that is there intrinsic from the beginning. I think the process of filmmaking is trying to find the truth of that story and bring it out and unite the characters with their story. I don't like it, for instance, when I see movies and I realize the story is driving these characters and they're not really mastering their story. They're always a victim of their story, and the story is the overriding element, and everything else, the characters, the locations, the places, everything else follows the story. And that for me can never really lead to a true story. A true story is something that I only believe if I feel it comes out of the characters and out of the places and everything falls into place, and it can only happen there and once. And even if it was invented, there is a truth to it, and it's the actors and the characters that make it true, and it's the place that makes it true, and it's the rhythm that makes it true, and it's something that rings through the entire film that makes it true, because the filmmakers found the truth. It is not there. If you have any script in the world, it's not true as such. You have to make it true while you do it.
So, thinking about the creative process that you go through, I know for you personally, music is very important. At what point do you start to transcend the images and the dialogue that you're shooting and start to hear the soundtrack or the music that inspires you to bring the film together?
I wish I had one simple answer, because it's not necessarily the same approach with each film, although there is something in common, at least in my own way to look at music or to listen to music and work it into a film. I'm always happy if the music is already there from the beginning. So, and even if the music is the subject of the film, like in When I Was at Social Club or Soul of a Man or other films I made where the music is the subject itself, there it is easy, because then the music is what the film is dealing with. So you're not adding it, you're filming it. It's there. It is what the film is all about. But mostly, especially when you tell a story, music is something that very often accompanies me while I'm trying to imagine the film or while I'm traveling on around in the place that I think is right for the film. And most of the time, in most of my soundtracks, where there's different bands and people playing, that is exactly the music I heard while I was shooting it or preparing it that ends up in the film. And sometimes, of course, you also have a film where you know you need music to be composed. Sometimes it's not just enough to have music coming out of the car radio or the jukebox or whatever, like source music, although I love that very much if the music is in the scene. But if you have a film where you know that you don't have any source music sometimes, like for instance, Paris, Texas. Paris, Texas has not a single piece of source music. There's no music coming out of jukeboxes or anything, except once in the very end, Travis gets into this strange peep show and there's a band playing or rehearsing. There is for a little moment, there is music that exists. But the rest of the film, he's always lonely and he's in places where there's no jukebox or radio or whatever. So music needed to be composed for the film. So I try to hear the sound of that music while I'm shooting. I try to guess what it is. I try to feel it in the air already. And writing or shooting or looking at your rushes in the evening, there is already a music inside, even if you haven't found it yet. And in the case of Paris, Texas, I knew from the first day of shooting that I was going to go to Ry Cooder, and I was going to give him a phone call and tell him that he was the only one to make the music for that film, because we had been friends for years and we had been wanting to make a film together, and it wasn't possible because the studio was opposed. At the time, the studio said, we want you to have, that was Hammett, the studio said, we want you to have a composer, not a guitar player. So Ryan and I were very disappointed. And then 4 years later, there was nobody who could impose anything on me. So I called Ry, and I knew all the time it was going to be him. And I said, I would like your guitar to accompany the film as the only voice and as the only music. And he took that very seriously, and he looked at a film where Miles Davis made the music, The Elevator to the Gallows. And the story goes that Miles Davis didn't compose it, he didn't write music. He stood in front of the screen and improvised the music to the film. And Ry, who doesn't write music, he doesn't know notes. I mean, he knows notes, but he cannot write music. He said, that's a great approach. That's what we're going to do with him. We're going to find a cinema, and then we have enough place. And I put up my equipment and my recording equipment and my guitar and my loudspeakers, and then you play the movie silently and I play the music to it. And he did that over and over again, every scene, sometimes 10, 20 times, until he was happy. He played it and then he said, no, that wasn't right. And he played it again, until in the end, I had the feeling, the very strange feeling, that this man with his guitar was refilming the movie, although it was finished, I had edited it, but with no sound and no dialogue, and just Ry with his guitar. It felt like he was reinventing the whole thing. His guitar became a magic, other kind of camera. And of course, that was sort of ideal, and it doesn't always happen like this, but in a way, your composer, if it's an orchestra or one instrument, like with Ry and his slide guitar, they sort of do something that is more than adding music. They do something in a way that between your film and its images and its story and the music, a third thing appears. It's more than the sum of your film and the music. Ideally, it's a third thing, it's a new thing, it's a different movie, and it's a different music than just by itself. It's a third, and I'm always sort of looking to find out what that third is that ideally happens between music and images.
It's a beautiful concept, and one that surely you will continue to explore through your work. But I guess the piece that I'm also interested to explore is moving from the music back to the images, and we think about the stories you're telling and the faces that you see telling those stories for you. How early in the creative process are you thinking about who plays your characters and who brings them to life?
Ideally, I know who these actors are when I even approach the film. Ideally, I know who this is. I knew this was going to be Bruno Ganz and Otto Sander when I first thought of Two Angels in Berlin and what could possibly happen to them. And I knew Sam Shepard was going to be the last cowboy in Don't Come Knocking. Ideally, you know it before. If you don't know it before, you have to go through what I consider, I just must confess it, the most painful process in the entire filmmaking chain, which is casting. Casting is so difficult. It's so much better if you know who's going to be playing something. And sometimes, of course, that doesn't happen. And there you are, and you're preparing a film, and you still don't know who's going to play the lead. And for some reason, whoever you thought should do it cannot do it. And there you are. And out of a sudden, you're in this casting situation. And all of a sudden, you're a victim and you're sitting in an office and you have a list in front of you. And in the course of a day or two or three, they run 100 actors by you. And that is the most painful thing because each of these people is in a way unique and marvelous. But the sad truth is sometimes they enter the door and you know it's not, no, cannot possibly be. This can be the greatest actor in the world who's just entering, but this is not the part. And that is the most painful process. And I think I've spent the most time in my casting with people who I knew from the beginning they couldn't possibly be that character because I just felt so guilty and I liked them. And I thought I can't just tell them, well, we can't work this out. So I spend a lot of time and I talk, and sometimes that leads to these people showing up in other movies right afterwards. For instance, I had this heartbreaking casting session, and this young woman came in, and she hadn't played any lead, and she had done a couple of beautiful movies, and my casting director spoke very highly of her, and her name was Michelle Williams. And I was thinking of, I thought I was going to do the movie that later turned out Don't Come Knocking. But that day I already knew the movie couldn't be made that year. It had to be postponed. For lots of reasons, we had to postpone it for a year. And I had to go through the rest of the casting, and I could have just as well canceled everything, but I thought that was crude, and these people had prepared themselves. So I saw them, and the last person that came in was this pretty small young woman, and she wasn't right for the part. And I started to talk with her, and I liked her very, very much. And I saw her, and I realized the camera was going to love her. And I realized the energy and the truth she had inside herself. And I was heartbroken. And that was the end of the casting session. And I went home, and that night I really made the last phone call about that movie. And then it was clear we're going to do it a year later. And then I thought, well, I have a year in front of me with nothing to do. What could I possibly do? Out of a sudden, I had a year, and I thought that night, I'm going to make a film with that last young actress, Michelle Williams. I'm going to write it for her, and we're going to shoot it in 3 weeks, and it's going to be the fastest film ever made. But I mean, that was a result of a hopeless casting session. And sometimes I remember actors for years, and I hope, I pray that one day I can give them a part, because the acting process is so painful. I think that it must be painful for actors. I wouldn't want to be an actor and sit and come into casting sessions. I wouldn't know what to do. And most directors don't know what to do. And it's awkward and difficult, and it's hard to make it a process where the actor feels respected and where there's a mutual respect, even if you know from the beginning, no, this is not it. So I don't like casting. So, but sometimes, of course, you do find amazing people that you don't know yet.
And speaking about people you meet at the beginning of their careers, as you know, MasterCard has worked closely with you as well to look at how we can be the proud partners of future filmmakers and inspire the next generation who will continue this glorious art form. What do you do? I know that you have various foundations, various activities that you're involved in that preserve cinema and inspires the next generation. How do you feel you can build a legacy that will ensure that the beauty of this art form continues?
Cinema is not a finished art form. It's something that is evolving, and it's only 125 years old. That's nothing. I mean, I worked with people who were still working in the silent era. As I knew people, I was working with them who had made silent movies as actors or craftspeople. So, and I was lucky enough to live cinema from a time when there was only film, celluloid, to the first beginning of television and electronic images, and finally to digital cinema, and eventually even to 3D, and not maybe a little bit to virtual reality. So I was able to see a whole span and to see this art form evolve incredibly. In the time that I'm working for, well, a good 50 years now. I've seen so many changes, and I've seen cinema go through so many ups and downs and evolve and become more complex and try to respond to its own time so as exactly as possible with so many different means. So it's an ongoing process. And I don't know how often people have declared the end of cinema. It's just as often as they declared that God was dead, I guess. And but it's an ongoing thing. And young filmmakers today, they must not be too impressed by the whole history of filmmaking, because they have to invent their own history. And most of them, if they know anything of the history of cinema, they've selected what they like in it. Like me, I've selected American cinema and I loved it. And I was heavily influenced by American cinema more than by European cinema. But everybody sort of, you find your own film history inside that vast empire, because you just cannot possibly know everything. Like when I started as a student, I had a feeling cinema was something that you could possibly get to know all aspects, because when I was sitting at the Cinematheque, I had a feeling I saw the entire cinema. But now, I mean, for young people, it's even too much to be on top of what's being produced. Even that is too much for them. So how can they also know the history of cinema? But still, I feel it's very important that you know a little bit of it, and that you catch glimpses, and that in these glimpses that you catch of the history of cinema, you realize what is worth for you taking into your own future. And it can just be one filmmaker or one aspect of filmmaking, but there is that whole treasure box of the history of cinema. And it'd be a waste to say I'm just going to invent it all by myself and I don't care what's been made. And some people have that attitude. But I think those filmmakers who have looked at it and who have decided what is the heritage that they'd like to take, and even if it's just a little chapter, it's worth it, because then you're building onto something. And just inventing it all by yourself, I think it's too much of a heavy load. It's great if you can build onto something, and even if you then do something that contradicts it and sort of leaves what you've learned about cinema before behind, that's fine. But you can only leave something behind if you know something. And quite often you find young filmmakers, and even among my own students, who just don't care, who are illiterate, so to speak, about the history of cinema, and I think they miss something. They don't have to know it all, but they have to know what is in there that would touch them and that they could build upon. And there's always something in there that you can build upon.
So, one of the themes that I want to explore as we bring this session to a close is I know, time flies, my friend, is thinking about that piece you say about inspiration. And I'd like to just double click a little bit on when you started out in your career, who were the cinema greats that inspired you, or even the small filmmakers that inspired you? And then looking ahead to sort of tomorrow's talent of the young filmmakers that you're seeing come through now, who are you really looking at and thinking they're making great work?
It's funny that when you get to see a few films, like you see a film by Truffaut and you think, oh, that's really wonderful. That's such a tender language and it's so unique. And then you see some other films by the man and you realize they all have that. And then in the end, all these movies by Truffaut become just like one movie. And that's his way of seeing the world. Or all the films of my great master, the Japanese director Yasujiro Ozu, my true master. He's made 52 films, and in my book, they're one big long movie. And so it's his work that really fascinated me and that inspired me. And that is in each scene and each shot, and it's in the attitude. And I think the true masters of cinema, they convey a sort of an attitude, a position towards the world and their way of seeing the world and making sense. And in a huge way, cinema is all about making sense. It's trying to make sense of your time and of your purpose and what you're here for and what you're trying to do. It's a way of expressing your opinion of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. So those young filmmakers who maybe in the beginning, when they start using the means and the tools of cinema, don't know yet what makes sense, I think, and I can really confirm this, I can tell them, by doing it, they will start making sense. And if you manage to make sense and from one film to the next and find out what is your own approach to making sense and what is your own language in there and what is your own way of seeing things, then you are really a filmmaker, and then you potentially can become one of the greats. And basically every young filmmaker potentially can become one of the greats as far as I'm concerned. It's just if they stick to their guns. And their guns is not gimmicks or things they've seen somewhere that they thought, oh, hell, I can do that. Their guns is what they have in themselves and what makes them unique and what they can do that nobody else can do. And I'm convinced that every young filmmaker possibly can do something that nobody else can do.
So we think you're one of the greats, Wim. We know that you're one of the greats, and I'm sure everyone watching this has enjoyed your words, has enjoyed your wisdom and a little bit of insight. I want to thank you so very much for participating. As you know, we call this series Life Through a Different Lens. And you have helped us and continue to help us see life through a different lens. I think you have a new film in production already. Is that right?
Yes, it's the same lens. No, it is in production. And like always, you don't want to talk about it as long as you're making it because that's bad luck. So I'm shooting something right now, yes. Actually, I'm working on 2 films, but they're both long-term documentaries, so they have to slowly grow. And we've been, like everybody else, postponed, and we had to push schedules and wait and sit around and let time go by like everybody else around the planet. most movies that I know of had to be postponed, and we are all involved in this together, in this waiting and in this slowing down, and which for many people was a good thing, because a lot of people, I think, at least in the arts, were able to reconsider what they think is essential and what really is important. Because when all of us out of a sudden can't work anymore, it's so much, you realize it's so much important what you do next. It matters in a different way. And now that I'm 75, it matters even more so, because when I was young, I thought I could make an infinite amount of movies. And now, especially after the pandemic, or we're still in it, as far as I'm concerned, out of a sudden it matters. What is it? Because I don't have an infinite amount of movies in me. Maybe I just have this one or two. So it matters more and more what you do. And I think that is one of the good sides of the hardship we all went through, or all are going through, that we maybe find out more what matters.
Well, you certainly matter to me and to all of your friends here at the 77th La Biennale in Venice. On behalf of your friends and family at MasterCard, all those watching around the world, Wim Wenders, you are a true inspiration, and thank you for your words today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rose. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Bye, everybody. Take good care. Take care of yourself.